geopolitics is really, put together from two elements. The first one is geo, which means the world, so our planet Earth, where we live, 200 countries, 7 billion people. And politics usually is about issues that human beings care about. It can be health, it can be education, it can be environment, it can be war, it can be terrorism, it can be peace. And if you take the two words together, then geopolitics can be translated as global politics. And what we do as historians, we look at the world and we say, well, who are the actors? And traditionally, historians have said the nation state is the actor. Of course, there we have to go into more detail and say, who runs the nation state anyway? Is it an oligarchy, or is the nation state really the people who live in that country? But if we leave that aside for the moment, we can say geopolitics is basically the interaction of all the nation states on planet Earth. So you start by counting how many nation states are there. Everybody knows that there is Russia, that there is Germany, that there is New Zealand, that there is Brazil, that there is United States. But when you start counting, you're like, oh, I know, you try to count how many nation states you know, where you've lived, maybe you've been to France, maybe to Nepal, Pakistan, Thailand. And at the end, you come up with a number roughly 200 nation states. The figure that is maybe most often quoted in newspapers is 193 nation states, because these are members of the United Nations. So Germany is a member of the United Nations, Switzerland is a member of the United Nations, Spain, the US. Then you have a few disputed territories like Kosovo. Kosovo is not really a nation state, but it is a piece of land. It used to be part of Serbia, and it was, cut away from Serbia. And exactly the historian then looks, well, how did they cut away that little bit? NATO bombed that country. How did they do that? And then we go back and look, what year was it? 99. Then we ask, was there a resolution by the Security Council? There was none. So then we have a case of war crimes. That was at the time of Clinton and Schröder and Joschka Fischer. And then we go into the details. So really geopolitics is about global power. And I think it's fascinating. It's much more interesting than any science fiction story or film with James Bond. These are just actors. I mean, of course you can watch actors. That's not the truth. It's much more interesting to look at what is Trump doing, what is Putin doing, what is Merkel doing, and what is Xi doing, the president of China. This is really interesting. And if you look into geostrategy, it's obviously not possible to have all 200 countries in your mind at the same time. It's impossible. You can't follow 200 countries at the same time. It's like if you're a teacher, you can't educate 200 kids at the same time. So really the best thing is to limit your awareness to maybe the most powerful 5. And the most powerful 5 clearly today are the United States, Russia, China, France, and the UK. Why do I think that these are the most powerful countries? I mean, obviously, I didn't mention Brazil, I didn't mention Germany, I didn't mention Japan, didn't mention Switzerland, where I was born and where I live. But these 5 are the most powerful because they sit in the Security Council of the United Nations. They have a veto power. All these 5 countries are nuclear powers. Germany is not a nuclear power. Japan is not a nuclear power. And these 5 countries, if you want, have won the Second World War. So you still have American troops here in Germany, here in Munich, where we do the interview. You have an awareness that the Americans have troops in Germany, but the Germans have no troops in the US. So, that always gives you an idea of geostrategic power. Where do they have military bases? Where do they have warships? Where do they have military planes? And the second thing that we look at, if we look at geostrategy, we don't only look at the 5 most powerful, we also look at pipelines, for instance. We're like, okay, where's the oil? How much oil do we need altogether? You know, you don't start with the question, how much oil does Munich need, or how much oil does Germany need? That's not a geostrategic question. The geostrategic question is, how much oil do we need as a human family every day? It's really a lot. It's 90 million barrels every day, and every barrel has 159 liters. So it's a lot of oil. And then you go like, okay, let's look at the 200 countries. Who has oil? Germany has none. Switzerland has none. Pakistan has none. But other countries have oil, like Kuwait, like Iraq, like Russia, like Saudi Arabia, like the US. And then you look at, okay, do they consume all the oil that they pump out of their ground, or do they export some of the oil? And if they export some of the oil, where does it go? And how to use the tankers to bring it here and there? So really is an analysis of global power structures. And geostrategy usually also looks at what's the biggest country on earth? You know, it's these simple questions that a 10-year-old can ask. And the biggest country is Russia. Okay, so everybody who's interested in geostrategy should be aware the biggest country is Russia, just from the size. And then second question, well, what's the country which is most dense with the biggest population? That's China. And you find out, okay, Russia and China are the big five. They're among the UN Security Council members. And then you go, okay, but what's the most powerful country? And the most powerful country is the United States. Why is it the most powerful country? Because really, it is dominant in military affairs today. So they have the most aircraft carriers. They have 10. The Russians have only 1. The Chinese have only 1. The French has only 1, and that's very often in repair. So really, the United States has also the biggest defense spending, roughly $600 billion, which is really a lot of money. And they have bombed most countries in the last 70 years. You know, geostrategy asks, well, what country is the record in bombing other countries in the last 70 years? It's the United States. And then the next step that we take is usually saying, okay, we have 200 countries, you said that. From within these 200, we have the big five, US, Russia, China, France, and Great Britain. But then within the five, is one stronger than the other five? And that clearly is the case of the United States. And that's why we say, as historians, the United States is the empire. It is, I have to add, a term which is not very often used. Okay, so if you watch TV, which I always say you shouldn't, unless you're interested in sports, but if you watch TV and you try to understand how the world works, here in Germany they have the Tagesschau, in the US they have Fox News and CNN and everything, and they give you news every day, but they never tell you that the United States is the empire. And if you don't have this term, okay, you're not able to understand geostrategy, because the empire has a tendency to behave in the same way. It usually tries to become bigger or stay at least as big as it is. Okay, that's been the case with the British Empire. That's been the case with the Roman Empire. And as a historian, I looked at the Spanish Empire. Okay, so the empire usually exploits and invades. It also tortures. So it doesn't have moral high ground. It just has military high ground and economic high ground. And so the empire tries to avoid the term empire. And if you look at geostrategy, you have to ask, okay, so the United States is the empire, I understand that, it's the most powerful country on the world. Since when is it the empire? Since 1945. So it was really the end of the Second World War, which led to a shift in global power balances. Shows you that during wars, huge wars, usually the power balances shift. And now the US empire is dominant. And in my new book, Illegal Wars, I use the term US empire, and I have some readers who write, I think that's very good. I don't hear this term very often in Germany. I don't hear it in the US, and I wish, you know, it was used more often, because, you know, it's a frank description of the situation, while others are irritated because they say, didn't know that there was an empire, and they're 50 years old or 60 years old, and they don't know what the empire is. So I think it's generally a good idea to research geostrategy, and I think everybody can learn about the power balance if he goes into the subject. I think that if you just stick to mainstream media news, you're never going to understand much about geopolitics, because it is not a systematic analysis of global power structures. You can basically read the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, which is a very famous newspaper in Switzerland. Many intellectuals would regard it to be the leading newspaper, or you can read the Süddeutsche Zeitung, which many people in Germany think is a really good newspaper. Or you can read Der Spiegel, and you can read it 10 years, or you can watch television, Tagesschau, 10 years on end, and you will never understand geopolitics, because these brands, they talk about politics, they talk about different countries, but they never give you an overview. They never tell you the US empire has military bases in 42 different countries and print a map, okay? So that would be the approach that you really need, okay? They had, one time they were covering the Guantanamo military base of the United States. And obviously, if you then watch the Tagesschau or the Süddeutsche Zeitung, you get a story about Guantanamo, okay? And you know that's an American military base in Cuba. So much you know. But you only know that limited element, and you don't get the geopolitical overview, because then it would be helpful just for young people, or also for 50-year-old people or 60-year-old people, to have a map of the world with all the countries that the United States has military bases, and it's 42 countries. So if you call it a map, and we did such a map in my institute, the Swiss Institute for Peace and Energy Research, CYPER. If you have such a map and you color the countries in blue where the United States has a military basis, there's a lot of blue on that map, okay? And then you get an overview. And the mainstream media avoids that. And obviously, you know, I have young people, 20-year-old people who ask me, why don't they print that, okay? I mean, that's the stuff we want to know. That gives you a good and detailed analysis. I want to have a map where you can see how many military bases do the Russians have in how many countries. It's around 10 countries. And the Americans in around 40 countries. Why do the Americans have military bases in Afghanistan, in Japan, in Diego Garcia, in Germany, Rammstein? Why do they have military bases all over the world? Then they are the empire, right? And I say, yeah, that's right. Then they are the empire. Why don't I hear it? And the answer really is that the empire is also engaging in what we call information warfare. So if you are the empire, just for a moment think that you are the US empire, or that you're Trump, or, I mean, it's hard to imagine, but just for a moment think that you are a wealthy king in Europe, okay? Then you don't want anybody to challenge you intellectually. You don't want historians to write, you are the empire, you bomb other countries, that's illegal. You have your soldiers in other countries, but you wouldn't want other countries to have their soldier in your country. So these are very basic questions, but you don't want them. So the Süddeutsche Zeitung, Der Spiegel, and the NZZ, they avoid the term US empire because they don't want to get into trouble with the United States. And very rarely, you find the term, this is imperial, okay, or the phrase, the US empire, you know, has destroyed the Swiss banking secrecy. That's something we had in Switzerland in the newspapers. NZZ am Sonntag wrote that. But they only wrote it when they were really angry, and usually you don't find it. Foreign policy really refers again to one aspect of geostrategy. We said already, when we look at geostrategy, we look at the countries of the world. And really there's 200 countries, we said that. And each country has a foreign policy. So the nation state is the actor in foreign policy. It's not a family, it's not an individual, it's not you and me who's doing foreign policy. So every country has a foreign minister. Okay, and if all the foreign ministers meet, then you have 200 foreign minister meeting. And they try to really have influence on other foreign ministers. Okay, they say, oh, we could do this thing together against that foreign minister, or we could link up and get this done. So foreign policy is really about the national interest. But in school books, usually it says the national interest of Germany is that we send the Bundeswehr, that's the German military, to Afghanistan. Or the national interest of the United States is to send the army and attack Iraq in 2003. And these things really happened. And then you find out, if you study the subject long enough, that foreign policy is not so much the interest of the nation state, but it is really the interest of the biggest companies in that nation state, or of the ruling families in that nation state. So basically, we call it oligarchs, okay? Very few people who profit from war. Because take the average German. Does he want to see the Bundeswehr in Afghanistan? No, he doesn't want that. So why do the Germans then send their army to Afghanistan? You have absolutely ridiculous explanations which are being offered to the public. At the time, Schröder, who was the chancellor, said that they have to defend German security on the Hindu Kush. Problem was, most Germans had never heard of the Hindu Kush. They knew that it was not a close-by mountain or an area of mountains. So if foreign policy was just representing the will of the people, then the people could vote on it. But this rarely happens. In my country, we can vote in Switzerland on whether we want to buy military jets. Okay, military jets, the government said, the Swiss government said, we need them, they're very helpful, we have to defend ourselves if the Russians come, or if the Germans come, or if whoever comes. Then the Swiss population went like, so how much did it cost? And it says, a few billions. And then the population had a vote. We said, we don't want these jets. So the government was not allowed to buy them. And if you had a similar vote in the United States, before they attacked Iraq in 2003, it was totally illegal. Bush is a war criminal. He had no right to attack Iraq. Then most probably the population would have been split on the issue. But the problem is that in foreign policy, the people have nothing to say in most countries. And foreign policy very often has to do with illegal acts. Because normally a country under the United Nations Charter, that's UN Charter, which was signed in 1945, has this rule that not one country is allowed to attack another country. That's the basic rule, okay? One country must not attack another country. So usually you should not have any foreign policy wars. You shouldn't have them. But they happen again and again because some nations try to gain influence, they try to control resources, they try to make money, they try to sell arms, and it's not good for world peace, not at all. So foreign policy is it's a very interesting subject, and if you look at it closely, you see that many countries have waged wars, and above all, the 5 members of the Security Council, when they wage war, they cannot be held accountable. So when Great Britain attacked Iraq in 2003, or when the French bombed Libya in 2011, together with the British and the Americans, there should have been a resolution of the Security Council condemning these countries, because you can't do it, okay? There's a rule, you can't do it. You can't attack another country. But these countries are in the Security Council, so the foreign ministers sit together in New York, and they said, well, look at this paper. We have a resolution which says we can do an operation in Libya. The Security Council said we can do an operation in the air. And then others say, okay, but the paper doesn't say that you could kill Gaddafi. And they say, yeah, sorry about that one. So I think civilians should wake up to the fact that foreign policy is sometimes really engaging in crimes. The United Nations was created in 1945 after the Second World War. And we just have to recall that the Second World War was the biggest disaster we ever had on human planet, as far as recorded history goes. We had 60 million people dead in the Second World War, and especially young people cannot really understand what that means. And I always say, imagine the population of France. They are 60 million people. And then imagine you go on a trip to Paris. And you arrive in Paris, everybody's dead. Every street you walk, everywhere you sort of look at things, everybody's dead. And that's just Paris. Then you go to Marseille, which is another big city. Everybody's dead there. And all the small villages you pass in between are also, everybody's dead. And if you sort of do this exercise, you go, gee, did we really do that? As a human family, did we do that? And the answer is yes. And then I say, furthermore, imagine that as a human family, we dropped atomic bombs on each other. I mean, an atomic bomb is really devastating. And they were dropped in 1945 by the Americans on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they were totally devastating. And at that time, people came together and said, war is really cruel. We should find a way to get out of war. And the progress that these human beings made at that time was, for the first time, they made war illegal in 1945. And they put it into the UN Charter and said one country is not allowed to attack another country. It's forbidden, and I mean really forbidden. You know, people know that it's forbidden to go into the street here in Munich and shoot somebody in the head. Okay, that's forbidden, that's murder. And in exactly the same way it is forbidden today that one country bombs another country, or that one country takes tanks and rolls across the frontier into another country, or that one country, and this happens very often unfortunately, funds a group of armed people in another country. That's secret warfare. So that all is forbidden. And this idea, I always insist, as a historian, is a huge progress. We never had a text that said war is illegal. So, interestingly enough, you don't only have the disaster of the Second World War on the one hand, something very, very dark. You also have something very, very bright, which is the first time that human beings came together and said, we now say war is illegal. So I always say this UN Charter is really a diamond. You know, this is something we should cherish. We should read it at schools. We should actually have it in the newspaper, that the newspaper spokesperson in the evening says, everybody knows that wars are illegal. It's stated in the UN Charter, Chapter 2, and then they could go into the details. But you know, they should remind people. But it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen, unfortunately. So many young people don't even know what the UN Charter is. They don't know that wars are illegal. And they say, well, you know, I've always heard that wars are ongoing, so why is this? I mean, when they are illegal, why is there war? And the answer really is that the structure of the UN is dysfunctional, unfortunately. We have 193 nations which are members of the United Nations, including Germany, the US, Russia, Switzerland, Austria, New Zealand. And of these 193, we really have an upper class, and that's just 5. And the rest, 188, are the lower class. So you have a class system, okay? And these 5, small minority, they have privileges which are unprecedented. Privileges that you can compare to a king in the Middle Ages. And that has nothing to do with egalitarian distribution of power. It's very much in the sense that these 5 can do whatever they want and they're not punished. I'll give you an example. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein, who then was the president of Iraq, invaded Kuwait. Kuwait is bordering Iraq, and according to the United Nations Charter, that's illegal. Okay, one country must not invade another country. I explained that before, and that is very, very true. You know, it's a good rule, and Saddam Hussein violated this rule, so he is a war criminal. And then the Security Council comes together. That's 15 members, but only 5 are permanent members, the US, Russia, China, France, and Great Britain. So they come together and say, have you seen Saddam just invaded Kuwait? And they go, well, you know, that's intolerable. He's violated the charter. So what they decide then is to pass a resolution which condemns this war and to actually put up an international army that pushes Saddam out of Kuwait again. That's what we call a legal war. It's a strange thing to even think of, but a legal war is either a war of self-defense or a war based on a resolution of the Security Council. So Saddam was pushed out of Kuwait again, and then the UN Security Council decided that they put the whole of Iraq under embargo. And after a few years, you know, the children in Iraq started dying. And there was a debate on US television. There was a journalist who said to UN Foreign Minister Madeleine Albright, we have 500,000 kids who now died in Iraq due to the sanctions. Is this embargo worth the price? And then very cruel, Albright said, yes, I think the price is worth it. And I really recommend, you know, that people Google this or watch it up on YouTube and go Albright and Iraq and sanctions. And I think the interview was in 1996. I'm not sure on the year, but it was in the 1990s. And then you go like, why is the UN Security Council, which is designed to promote peace and to protect human beings and human dignity, killing 500,000 kids? That's 500,000. I mean, when I was just a student then, in 1996 I was a student. I was 24 years old. When I read this, I was going like, what's wrong with the UN? They have a massive problem. And you had members in the United Nations who were working for the UN and they were resigning. Hans von Sporneck, for instance, he was resigning. He said, I can't do this. I mean, incredible. And you also see this dysfunctional structure of the Security Council, not only with this embargo, you also see it when the French and the British, for instance, bombed Egypt in 1956. That was the so-called Suez Crisis. Together with the Israelis, they attacked Egypt. This is totally illegal. You can't do it. As I repeat, the UN Charter says not one country can attack another country. But they did it, they bombed the country, and then the Security Council came together and they should have punished the French and the British. But, as I said before, the French and the British are veto powers in the Security Council. So they put their veto, and you couldn't punish them. In 2003, Tony Blair of Great Britain and George Bush of the United States attacked Iraq. They just bombed Iraq, just like that. Totally illegal. They should be punished. They're war criminals. Blair is a war criminal and Bush is a war criminal. But they can't be punished because the Security Council can't pass a resolution when the veto powers say no. In 2001, we had the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States. They are not clear what happened there. You know, historians have a really, really hard time to find out what happened there. But to put a long story short, after 9/11, that was September 11, 2001, you had in October 2001, the United States attacking Afghanistan. Again, actually what we need is a resolution of the Security Council. They didn't have that. So the war against Afghanistan is illegal. The Germans went to Afghanistan. Illegal, you can't do it. Think about the Afghanistan army coming to Germany in 2001. Nobody would want that. So what we need is a reform of the United Nations. The 5 members in the Security Council should actually give away their veto. But the problem is, they don't want to do that. I think the United Nations, with headquarters in New York and a subsidiary branch in Geneva, Switzerland, are still the World Peace Organization. You know, we call it, in all historical documents, we call it the World Peace Organization. But then we should also be aware of the fact that it's not the first World Peace Organization. We had the League of Nations, which failed utterly and couldn't prevent the Second World War from happening. And I think as a human family today, we should think of whether we want World War III or whether we don't want it. Everybody has to decide for himself, because the future is nothing which is now fixed or which is determined. This is something which depends on all of us, and it depends on what we want. And from many, many conversations that I had with many, many people in many, many countries, I can tell you as a fact that most people want peace. They don't want war. So it's something like we should be able to do it. If many, many people want it, I'm saying 90%, okay? I'm saying 90% of global population in all countries, across all classes, want peace. Because they don't want to see their kids shot, they don't want to walk on a landmine, they don't want to live in a house which is being bombed, okay? They just don't want it. So we have an overwhelming, really overwhelming will for peace. At the same time, we see that United Nations don't really work. And what can we do? Right now, I think the best that we can do is to have a strong Secretary General. That'd be something very good. Kofi Annan, for instance, was a rather strong Secretary General. Ban Ki-moon was not very strong. And if I think back to Kofi Annan, he came up on television and said that the war against Iraq was illegal. So he's basically the face telling the story, because today you always have a face, okay? The United States is Trump, Russia is Putin, and Germany is Merkel. Obviously that's not true. I mean, not everybody in Germany looks like Merkel, and not everybody in the US agrees with Trump, or not everybody in Russia agrees with Putin. So, this is a very strong simplification that we do in international politics. But the UN is the General Secretary. And it would be very good, I think, that every time that a war breaks out, for instance, 2011, the war against Libya, or 2001, the war against Afghanistan, or 2003, the war against Iraq, many wars breaking out all the time, that the Secretary General goes in front of a global TV audience and says, let's not forget, ladies and gentlemen, that the UN Charter has declared that all wars are illegal. And so is this war. It is illegal. I call upon all nations to refrain from using military action. I think he could do it. Unfortunately, he very often doesn't do it. And when he does it, like Kofi Annan, I looked at the data very clearly, he does it rather late, okay? The attack from the British and the Americans on Iraq came in 2003, and Kofi Annan addressed the global media in 2004. So he had like 1 year of delay. I mean, that's a lot of delay. He was right in the substance. He said this war is illegal, and people listened to him. I mean, people are much more inclined to believe what the General Secretary says than what a president or prime minister says. They know, that these people are out for power and money and greed. But they think that the Secretary General represents, in many ways, the hopes for a better future, for more peace, for more justice. And so my suggestion would be that whenever a war breaks out, the Secretary General should step in front of the camera the same day, okay? The same day. And then you had television stations and newspapers and alternative media reporting the statement from the Secretary General, and he could always say wars are illegal, because that's in the UN Charter. He doesn't need to come up with a new text. Students have asked me, okay, clever idea, why doesn't he do it? And the answer is, he's being given his job not just by the world population, but by the 5 members of the Security Council. And they are the US, Russia, China, the British, and the French. So if these 5 attack another country, and just imagine, you know, you're the Secretary General, and you go like, this war is illegal. Then you've just criticized your boss. You're going to be fired. And so this is a dilemma that we have. I think we need a reform. I think we should preserve what is good in the United Nations, which is the UN Charter, which says wars are illegal. And I think if the Secretary General had the strength, you know, to criticize the members of the Security Council, that would really be a step ahead. Right now, I don't see this power. And also, I can't call the Secretary General and tell him, next time a war breaks out, step in front of the camera and make it clear for the kids on the whole planet that this is illegal. Yeah, but you know, it is possible to change things for the better. It is possible. I just maybe conclude with one example. In Switzerland, we introduced voting rights for women in 1971. So, 46 years ago. And before, people were convinced, you know, that it would be dreadful to give women the voting right. Because they said women are too stupid and too emotional. They said that. So they said it's impossible. It's really a shame to look back on that, you know, and I'm very happy that today women have the vote in Switzerland. But if I transfer this to the UN, then I say we have the proof that progress can come. We have the proof that systems can change. We're not stuck, and it's not a given that we will kill each other in the 21st century. It's a possibility. We can do that. We have nuclear arms. We have 16,000 nuclear bombs, so we can kill each other many times. But we can also walk towards peace. And as I said, the majority, 90% of the world population want peace. And so do I. Well, secret operations or secret wars are something really, really very delicate. They are illegal, okay, because one country is not allowed to attack another country according to the UN Charter, but they exist. We have the historical proof. And personal experience that I have with secret operations is that I was a student at Basel University. I was 25 years old, and I was researching the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because I knew, the Soviets put nuclear weapons in Cuba in 1962, and I knew that this almost led to World War III. So I was really, interested, why did human beings do that, and why as a human family do we do these things, and if we continue doing these things, we blow each other up one day, just by accident. And then I read the details of the Cuban history, and if you want to understand secret operations, I think you should start with Cuba. Because when Fidel Castro, the then leader of Cuba, came to power in 1959, he said, I want to make this country completely different. It's been exploited by rich guys, and now I'm going to send the rich guys to hell. They can, leave, and I'm going to make a new system so that the kids can read, that they can go to hospitals, and I'm going to just make it much, much more just. The Americans, at the time you had President Eisenhower was in charge, and the CIA director was Allen Dulles. They didn't like it, okay? They didn't like it. So they thought we should get rid of Nixon. We should get rid of Fidel Castro. And even Nixon, who was vice president at the time, said, to Eisenhower, we should get rid of Fidel Castro. He's a communist. Let's get rid of him. But then you had this huge United States and this small country, Cuba. And I'm from Switzerland, so I always like the small countries. I'm like, oh, what did they do? That's really difficult. It's a bit of a story of Goliath and David. And then Fidel Castro knew that they were trying to overthrow him. And what the CIA first did is they used covert action, okay? Covert action is something that you don't tell the public. They trained a group of exile Cubans in Florida. They flew them, the CIA did that. They flew them to Guatemala, gave them training, gave them weapons, and then sent them with a boat to Cuba, and their job was to fight a war there. That was the so-called Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. And then the American foreign minister was asked by the newspaper, Dean Rusk, he was asked, is America attacking Cuba? And he said, of course not. We're not doing that. So that's, you know, that's a trick with secret warfare. You do something, but when somebody asks you whether you do it, you say, oh no, I'm not involved. That's the lie. And then the Americans bombed Cuba, also in 61. So if you bomb a country, it's quite obvious that something is going on. So the Cubans went to the UN Security Council, and I described this as in my book, Illegal Wars. And the foreign minister of Cuba was Raul Roa, and he said, we're being bombed by the United States. This is illegal. And then the UN ambassador from the United States, Adlai Stevenson, went there and said, you know, then you have to come up with a cover story if it's covert warfare. You can't say, yeah, we're doing that. Then it's not secret warfare anymore. And then he came up with a cover story and said, these are Cuban pilots, and they're bombing their own country because they really hate communism. They really hate Fidel Castro. And before fleeing to the country of the free and the brave, the United States, they just bombed their own country. So it's like this story of this kid was really angry with his family, so he left the house. And before he left the house, he blew it up with his mother and his sister and his father all dead. It's just a stupid story. And it was a lie. So this is really covert action. You carry out an operation and you hide behind the concept of plausible deniability. You say, I didn't do that. You lie. And it's not that this is something years ago, you know, that didn't happen anymore. In 2011, the Syrian war started. And you can't understand the Syrian war if you don't see the element of covert action, because Syria was basically covert action from the start. The CIA invested $1 billion, okay, that's a 1 and 9 zeros, so there's a lot of cash, much more cash than everybody of us has, into a covert operation in Syria with the name Operation Timber Sycamore. This operation aimed at overthrowing the government in Syria, Assad. And that's, again, illegal. It's the same pattern that you had with Fidel Castro. I didn't finish the story with Cuba. Fidel Castro survived, right? He defeated this invasion. Then the CIA later tried to kill him with assassination operations. They knew that Fidel Castro liked to go scuba diving. So they planted seashells with explosives. And they thought he would, you know, touch it and die. It didn't work. Fidel Castro survived. And that's the same now with Assad, okay? Assad seems to be surviving the secret war of the CIA. And the very strange thing is that the CIA doesn't care about the group that they arm, okay? They go to radical Muslims, give them money, give them weapons, and say, overthrow Assad. When the public then says, are you really doing this? They say, oh no, I'm not doing this. This is just an internal war in Syria. Bollocks. It was never it was a secret war from the start. And the second thing that you do, if you're an empire, and the United States is the empire, you use your special forces. What are special forces? Special forces are, in Great Britain, for instance, the SIS, Special Air Services, or in the United States, the Green Berets. And they go to many countries. They enter the country without a declaration of war, okay? So they enter illegally. The host country doesn't even know that they're coming. And they don't have, you know, the American flag or the British flag or the French flag here and here the name. They have no insignia. And they're the best, okay? They can survive alone in the desert, in the jungle, and in the mountains. So they're really the hard guys. Many kids have seen Rambo, okay? That's a science fiction, that's a fiction character with Sylvester Stallone. But he's a special forces guy. And what they do is they fight behind enemy lines, they train groups to then overthrow governments. And I said that in Cuba it didn't work. In Syria, it started in 2011. We're now 2017, okay? The war has changed into an open war. Obama started to bomb the country. Trump is continuing to bomb the country. So a secret war can change into an open war. But still, Syria, it's not sure whether the US empire will be able to overthrow Assad. And in other cases, we really have examples where it worked. So, for instance, in 1953, the MI6, the British Secret Service, and the CIA overthrew the government of Mossadegh, the prime minister in Iran. That was totally illegal. People in Europe and America have completely forgotten about it, but the Iranians have not forgotten. In 1973, the CIA overthrew the government of Allende in Chile. Totally illegal. You can't do it. You know, think about the Chilean Secret Service overthrowing the US government in 73. It's incredible. You can't do it. It's totally illegal. But they did that, and they installed Pinochet, dictator, brutal dictator. In 1979, the CIA started to arm the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, okay? And many people don't remember that the CIA actually built up Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan because they wanted to create, I quote, a Vietnam for the Russians. You know, they drew the Russians into Afghanistan. The Russians fought against the Afghani, against the Mujahideen, and the CIA supported them. In the 80s, it was not a secret anymore, but in the beginning, it was a total secret. So, secret warfare is something I've worked on for many, many years. And basically, you can say you don't read about it in the newspaper, you just don't, or only many years later. You don't hear about it on television, or only many years later. And therefore, people get a very wrong picture of international politics. They don't understand that secret war exists. And I think if we have a realistic approach to secret warfare, we should really look at it and say, hey, how did the French blow up the Greenpeace ship Rainbow Warrior? How did they do it? And that's, you know, stuff I research. And just one last example. The French are a nuclear power, and they were carrying out nuclear tests in the Pacific. So French President François Mitterrand in the 80s said, we want, you know, to carry out nuclear tests in the Pacific. There's nobody living there anyway, which meant no French people were living there. You know, that was the Mururoa atoll. There's some people were living there, but they said, go away, we're going to blow up some atomic bombs. Insane, totally insane. And then the Greenpeace ship Rainbow Warrior, Greenpeace is an environmental organization, well known, I guess, they went there. So the French were really angry. They said, oh, now we can't blow up our atomic bombs because the stupid Greenpeace activists come with their ship, and this is going to create a lot of trouble. So they sent the French Secret Service, Direction Générale Sécurité Extérieure, DGSE, to New Zealand, where the Greenpeace ship was in the harbor. And they sent frogmen to the ship. They planted bombs on the ship and blew it up. That's state terrorism. They killed one Greenpeace photographer on the ship. And the French agents, which entered New Zealand in 1985, and that's something that really upset me when I read the documents, they pretended to be Swiss citizens, okay? So they used different passports. So that's secret warfare. You carry out clandestine operations, and it's usually the Secret Service and the Special Forces.